All right, folks. Ambassador John Bolton is about to join us, and of course, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and AEI Senior Fellow. And I want to talk to the ambassador. And Mr. Ambassador, just hold on. I want you to watch Hillary Clinton the other day, and then we'll talk about it. Everybody out there also, watch this video right now.
What he said to me was, look, I have to be dealing with the economic crisis. I want you to go out and represent us around the world. And it was a good division of labor because we needed to make it clear to the rest of the world that we were going to get our house in order. We were going to stimulate and grow and get back to positive growth and work with our friends and partners. So I think we did that.
All right, folks. I want you to hear one more of Hillary Clinton. Can we do 22? And I want you, before we go to John Bolton, I want you to hear what she basically, after all the hamina, this is what she came up with as her biggest accomplishment of Secretary of State.
And I'm very proud of the stabilization and the, really solid leadership that the administration provided. That I think now leads us to be able to deal with problems like Ukraine, because we're not so worried about a massive collapse in Europe and China trying to figure out what to do with their bond holdings and all the problems we were obsessed with.
All right, so there you go. Now that the economy is on a good track, now she feels that the State Department, in her absence, I guess, could go on to deal with the affairs of state. Joining us now is our friend, the great former ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, AEI Senior Fellow, and by the way, the author of the cover story in this month's April edition of Newsmax the magazine, Vladimir Putin's New Cold War. Hello, sir.
Hi, Steve. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming back. I hope you're feeling better. So, Hillary, I think she was really caught off guard by this on this question by Thomas Friedman. She went on and on and on before she even got to that, and that was the best she could come up with.
Well, I think it was a very embarrassing answer, but let's face it, it's a very difficult question for her to confront because her record as Secretary of State was embarrassing. It's not just the tragedy at Benghazi, although she's going to have to answer for that for a long while. It's the lack of accomplishment on so many different areas. And indeed, when she uses the example of Ukraine, it was her inattention to the potential threat posed by Russia for 5 years that convinced Putin he could do what he's doing even today as we speak, and getting away with it. So I think if she runs for president, and there's every indication that's what she's going to do, she may well waltz to the Democratic Party nomination. But it's going to be a very interesting general election campaign.
Yeah, I was really shocked, and later we're going to hear more from Hillary, but if I played you the entire lead up to that answer, she was hemming and hawing and talking about the economic crisis that they inherited when Obama came in and how Obama said, you handle the affairs of state and I'll handle the economy, which of course is the same with any president and secretary of state. And boy, oh boy, we had so many problems in getting growth in the economy. She was caught off guard, which was really unlike her, and it's going to be interesting to see how she modifies that answer and perfects it, if you will, going forward.
Well, it reminded me of the famous embarrassment for Teddy Kennedy back in 1980 when he challenged Jimmy Carter for re-nomination in the Democratic Party, and a TV anchor asked Kennedy why he was running for president, and he couldn't answer the question. And I don't think his campaign really ever recovered from that moment. So Hillary has more time, and I'm sure the media will cover for her, but she has the same problem. She has no record to run on, and since being Secretary of State is basically the biggest line on her resume, the fact that she spent 4 years traveling the globe but not accomplishing much is going to be very hard to explain.
All right, let's move to another disaster on the part of the administration, and that's the Middle East so-called peace talks, which, I mean, you can't keep up with it day by day, but I guess they're basically off. Mahmoud Abbas pulling a fast one on the spokesman for the Palestinian people, John Kerry, and filling out these applications to go to the UN and look for acceptance for a Palestinian state. Whether or not he follows through on that, time will tell. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's just done, correct?
Well, it is. The administration is trying to say that it's simply suspended, and that presumably, therefore, the talks can be brought back online. But the fact is, these talks were doomed from the outset. The Palestinians don't have their act together. They don't have institutions that can make hard agreements, difficult compromises, and then implement them in the years to come. And so if you're in Israel's position, you say, what's the point of negotiating with somebody on the other side of the table who can't live up to whatever bargain we may make, number one. And number two, even worse, the prospect that after agreeing to a Palestinian state, you end up with Hamas or some other terrorist group in charge of it. And I think that was the basic flaw all along. And it's interesting now that, as you just pointed out, the party that really put the kibosh on these talks is the Palestinians. And that's not the narrative that John Kerry hoped for. He hoped to be able to blame Benjamin Netanyahu in hopes of influencing Israeli politics. But Netanyahu did virtually everything the administration asked in ways that I'm not sure were in his political best interest or Israel's best interest, but to show to the American people, Congress in particular, that Israel really did want to try and find peace. And so I think we've seen this whole thing exposed now, and sadly, it's only one of three major negotiations in the Middle East that are failing or have already failed. Syria, the civil war in Syria, where those negotiations have produced nothing, and Iran's nuclear weapons program, which have been a benefit to Iran. So I think when you add all this together, the Obama administration's Middle East policy is in complete collapse.
Yeah, and of course, you're right. He would have loved to have blamed Benjamin Netanyahu, but he did his best because on Friday he blamed both people for not making the tough choices and not cooperating, and he put it all on equal footing, which I guess is in Obama land as fair as you'll ever going to get from this administration.
Yeah, it's a kind of moral equivalence, and everybody's to blame. But in fact, however they try and spin it, this is a failure for the United States, and it's a failure that was entirely predictable. It was a misallocation of resources. This had no chance of succeeding, but the illusion that Obama and Kerry operated under was that they could pressure Israel into making concessions that would produce progress. And instead, it now looks like what it is, another American failure, another sign of decreased American influence in the Middle East, and maybe even worse, by having devoted all this time and energy to this failure. That's time and energy that wasn't spent on something else, dealing with Russia's aggressiveness in Ukraine and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, dealing with China's assertive territorial claims in the East and South China Sea, dealing with Iran's proliferation, dealing with international terrorism. Instead, they were pursuing a pipe dream.
Yeah. All right. Let me ask you this, sir. Today, the U.S. Supreme Court turned down Larry Klayman's request to fast-track his case against the NSA bulk collection of phone records, which he won in a lower court. He wanted it fast-tracked to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court today said no. You, of course, believe that the NSA program is a useful program.
Yes, I thought the lower court was clearly wrong. I think the Supreme Court's decision not to grant expedited treatment doesn't necessarily speak to how they will come out on the merits, but it shows they're certainly not going to give it any different treatment than a run-of-the-mill case. I think it'll wend its way through, and we'll see what happens. But I wouldn't read too much into it, but it's hardly a good sign for the anti-NSA side.
And in your piece at Newsmax, of course, you write about how Vladimir Putin is imposing his will on the world. We only have about a minute left, so I don't want you to go in and make it a little tease for the readers and the listeners and the viewers to get Newsmax, the magazine, and check out the cover story by John Bolton. But are we any worse off this week than we were last week, or are we status quo?
Well, I think we are worse off. I think Putin has seen that the administration is not going to do anything to try to roll them back to Crimea, and it's already started to agitate in eastern and southern Ukraine for more of what we saw in the Crimea. So I think further partition of Ukraine is at least possible, or certainly Putin is upping the ante in his negotiation with Kiev to make sure that whatever government emerges there after the upcoming elections is a government that Russia can dominate. So Putin has learned all the wrong lessons from Obama's weakness.
Mr. Ambassador, I still hear the little bit of cold. Get better completely, and thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure.
Well, thank you. Thanks again for having me.
My pleasure. That's Ambassador John Bolton, ladies and gentlemen. Very interesting. We'll talk about a lot of this with the panel. It's next, right here. You know where it is, on the Steve Malzberg Show on Newsmax Television.
The Steve Malzberg Show.